On December 8, 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty, a historic deal that forced both superpowers to scrap an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was a turning point that reduced the nuclear threat in Europe. But the real question for us today is this: how was such a breakthrough possible, and what lessons can Europe draw from it as leaders struggle to end the war in Ukraine? In 1977, German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt pointed out in a speech in London that the Soviet Union had gained a strategic advantage in Europe by pre-arming Forosten itself since 1975. He advocated countermeasures by NATO, but at the same time also called for arms control talks with the Soviet Union. Washington and European capitals took up this demand, which resulted in NATO's double-track decision on 12 December 1979. The strategy had two parts. First, negotiations were opened with the Soviet Union to reduce its SS-20 medium-range missiles. Secondly, it set out the consequences of failure. If the negotiations broke down, the United States would deploy its own medium-range nuclear forces, including the highly accurate and longer-range Pershing II missiles, in West Germany and other European countries within 4 years. Negotiations initially broke down, and between 1983 and 1987 the United States deployed new medium-range missiles in 4 NATO countries: Belgium, West Germany, Britain and Italy. Armament continued in the years that followed until the Soviet Union under Gorbachev signaled its willingness to cooperate with the West. Talks resumed in 1985 and ultimately resulted in the signing of the INF Treaty on 8 December 1987. German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was important in this process and stood by his decision to deploy the Pershings in West Germany despite strong opposition in German society. In a 1987 interview, he reflected on this decision. Asked whether the deployment of Pershing and ground-launched cruise missiles had been necessary, Schmidt offered an answer that is relevant to today's debates on European security. He said, and I am quoting him here, "I say they were absolutely necessary in order to bring the Russians to the negotiation table, and I was willing to deploy them in order to bring the Russians to the negotiation table, and I had the intent and even the conviction that these negotiations would lead to results. Not necessarily to the 0-0 result, but to a result of limitation of numbers on either side, and to the result of equilibrium in Eurostrategic missiles. Equilibrium is the catchword." End of quote here. 3 elements of Schmidt's remark stand out. And a quick note here before I go into these 3 elements. Now it would be a good time for you to hit that subscribe button. With over 90% of viewers not subscribed, I'm basically the outnumbered state in YouTube's great power game. Help me balance the system, don't free ride. Subscribe. Thank you very much. So back to the 3 elements of Chancellor Schmidt's remark. First, true statesmanship needs a balance of deterrence and dialogue. To prioritize one while neglecting the other is self-defeating in a way. History does not repeat itself in a neat pattern. Today's circumstances are different, but the underlying lesson still applies, which is effective strategy demands a dual track. Credible defense and diplomacy must reinforce rather than exclude one another. The spiral model of the security dilemma shows that when one state increases its security, another state or group of states feels threatened and takes countermeasures. This is currently the case in the context of the war in Ukraine. European states have responded correctly by investing in their defense, but if this is not accompanied by dialogue, there is a risk of deliberate or unintended escalation into a larger conflict. even if the Trump administration's approach was at times, we can say clumsy. One image comes to mind, Witkoff alone in Moscow. Despite that, it was still one of those signals that carried the potential for de-escalation. At the same time, Europe must keep up the pressure. Signals of de-escalation have to come from both sides, of course, and Russia must also demonstrate a willingness to engage in dialogue. The pathway that ultimately produced the Washington Treaty, the INF Treaty, so that's a synonym for it, shows this point clearly. And as George Beebe, Director of Grand Strategy at the Queen's Institute, also puts it, and I am quoting him here from an article, the Russians are not going to get everything they want out of this. Neither will we. Both sides are going to have to get their most vital interests protected in all of this. That's a truism in diplomatic agreements. So, end of quote. Second, Europe needs a coalition of the willing. The NATO double-track decision was a trilateral undertaking. German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt introduced it to the European public in 1977, relying on the backing of President Jimmy Carter in Washington and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in London. Together, these leaders resolved to counter the Soviet Union's build-up with a dual strategy. The strategy was modernizing NATO's nuclear forces in Europe while simultaneously opening negotiations on arms control with the Soviet Union side. And as today, there was no European unity back then. The French government publicly criticized the decision and protested against the arms race it initially triggered. And then third, what we can learn from this quote in the beginning from Chancellor Schmidt. Chancellor Schmidt managed to stand firm on an unpopular decision until the very end. For the deployment of the Pershing missiles, he needed a majority in the Federal Republic's parliament, and he secured it. But the protests were enormous. Civil society in particular voiced strong criticism of NATO's double-track decision. Fear of nuclear escalation ran high among the German population, and there were large protests throughout the West German Republic. But Chancellor Schmidt stood by his decision. It led to the collapse of the Social Liberal Coalition in October 1982. This is statesmanship, and that is what Europe needs today. Leaders with the courage to make unpopular decisions and see them through. As Schmidt's example shows, this leadership can lead to a more secure Europe. If handled effectively, Europeans could soon find themselves in a far stronger position than they do today. And I think the urgency is clear. An axis of upheaval is already forming. This week we had the image of Xi Jinping presiding over his military parade in Tiananmen Square, flanked by Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. And I think this image could not be clearer. And Switzerland, it held some surprising lessons for European unity and its future. If you are curious, click right here to watch the next video. See you there.